Okay, I think that we can start with the opening remarks, so that those people who are joining late, I think that they would still be in time for the substantive part of the presentation. So welcome to the webinar on the Asian Outlook, where we are going to give you an update on the work that the ATO team has been doing since the start of the third phase in March. What we will be doing in this presentation is giving you an insight, especially into two recent reports, which will be presented in more detail by Sudhir Gota. In welcoming you, I would like to give a special word of welcome to the participants of the 15th Environmental Sustainable Transport Forum, which will take place in Malaysia, I think week after next. We are looking forward to meet up with all of you. We will be happy to discuss the ATO in much more detail when our team is in Malaysia, but we know that some of you are working on the preparation of the country reports for the ESG forum, and obviously the ATO has quite a lot of information to provide for that. So if you're working on that, and if you have questions on how to best use the ATO, please do not hesitate either to ask a question at the end of this webinar or to send me an email after this call, after this webinar. Yeah. I already mentioned, please mute yourself during the webinar. In case you have questions, please raise your hand so that after the presentation we can come back to you. And please also enter your questions in the chat window as well. Yeah. With that, let's start. You can see there's one new word on this opening slide, and this is the word observatory. Like this is a term that we have started to use to describe the Asian Transport Outlook. In the past, we would say Asian Transport Outlook, the transport database for the Asia Pacific region. But as you will find out in this presentation, like we are moving actually beyond pure data. You will hear a lot of references to policy during the webinar as well. So this is something I think I just wanted to flag that. With that, I would like to hand over first to Jamie Leather, Director Transport in the Asian Development Bank, and ADB has been a very generous supporter of the ATO since its inception in 2020. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Corny, and welcome everybody to this Asian Transport Outlook webinar. You said we were a great supporter, or the Asian Development Bank has been a great supporter of the ATO. That's because we believe it has a significant role to play in improving the transport systems that are delivered across the developing countries of Asia and the Pacific. And I hope you will gain a little bit of why we believe that the great work that has been done and will be done on the ATO will greatly enhance accessibility, mobility for people and goods across the region. The ATO looks at transport infrastructure, it looks at activity, and it looks at externalities. We also have a specific focus in urban areas and cost data and policy work, which Corny has mentioned. It is open source, so everyone has access to this. We're working very closely with donor partners, think tanks, and our developing member countries. And I'd like to make a special mention to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, who are with us today, because we're working very closely with them to utilize and roll out the ATO. The real reason why we see such value in this is that the data and the dialogue that this allows us to have with our government counterparts, or looking at what trajectories the transport sector is on, is greatly enhanced by having better data, and that better data leads to better decisions, and those better decisions lead to a better impact of what we are trying to achieve in the transport sector. We may often look at it very narrowly as just transport infrastructure or filling missing gaps, but from a development perspective, it's really looking at providing that access or moving those goods. So it enhances economic growth, it lifts people out of poverty, it allows them to get to work, to education, to hospitals, it allows transportation costs to be reduced if we have good integrated multimodal transport systems. And it's when we look at a whole database like this with many different metrics relating to the sector that different perspectives and different needs and requirements or different priorities come to the fore. If we look at it just as lines on maps for different modes, we may end up making the wrong decision. So the ATO is being quite instrumental in looking where transport currently is and what direction it needs to head. That's the development side. As a financial institution, both us and AIIB are development banks. We want to use this data to provide financial support and technical assistance to governments in the region. So thank you all very much for joining. Please look at this, and if you find anything interesting, reach out to us. More importantly, if we can utilize this data to make better informed decisions on the transport sector, that's even better. Thank you very much. Back to you, Connie.
Thank you, Jamie. And we will hear from AIIB also after the presentation. Yeah. For those of you who have just joined, please mute yourself. Any questions you have, please put them in the chat window, and we will come back to that after the presentation. Okay, what I will do is I will give a brief introduction to the ATO, and after that, Sudhir will take over and will present the more substantive parts of the ATO. I had mentioned before that the ATO started in 2020, but we are actually building on the work that other people have done in terms of transport data in the Asian region before. And this is something we looked at in a fair amount of detail in 2019 and 2020, that we say, like, why is it that there is no institutionalized approach to the collection and the documentation and the dissemination of transport data in Asia? So we said, like, it's clear we want to create something which is not just a one-off project, but something which will continue and which is a more or less permanent resource and a growing body of knowledge. And this is what you actually see on this slide. You see phase 1, interim phase, phase 2, phase 3. And phase 3, which we are currently in, will end in November 2024. But actually, we are already working on the planning, and there is a commitment already from the side of the Asian Development Bank to also fund a possible phase 4. And Jamie often talks about phase 5 and phase 6 as well. So it's clear that this is not a one-off initiative, but this is a clear effort to create a knowledge base which will continue to grow and which will continue to be available to the community. In the transport outlook, so we are trying to serve three purposes. Like, first and foremost, we are supporting the planning and delivery of transport-related assistance by the Asian Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. I saw that there were a number of staff from AIIB on this call, and often what we get is ad hoc requests from the transport staff in these organizations for data or policy information, and we're happy to provide that then to them. In addition to that, and I mentioned the Environmental Sustainable Transport Forum in Asia, it is clear that the EST is also an important input to support policy making in the field of transport in Asia. And we are looking forward in the months and the years to come to also work more closely with transport ministries and say, like, how can we make our knowledge available to them as well? And then lastly, but not least, it's clear that it is important as well to track global agreements on sustainable development and climate change at the global level, And in addition to that, at the regional level, we are also working very closely with the United Nations Center for Regional Development in tracking the Aichi 2030 Declaration on environmentally sustainable transport. And on this third part, on tracking the global agreements, you will hear quite a lot from Sudhir later on as well. So who is the ATO team? So the ATO team is being led by Sudhir and me. In addition to that, we have Mel, Abweed, Alvin, and Benjo, who are working with us. So basically, it's a team of 6 persons. Some of them are working full-time, some of them are working part-time. And this is a team which has been in place since 2020. We're very happy with the inputs. We see here Jamie's name and Andres, his name for AIIB. Obviously, there are more people both in ADB and in AIIB who are working with us, and all of them are important to us. So the ATO framework, if we look on the left, the Asian Transport Outlook, the box on the left, it says data and policy. And I think that this is one of the innovations of the ATO. In the past, there was an emphasis on data, and there was relatively less emphasis on policy. For us, both are equally important if we talk about knowledge on the sector. It's clear that we collect information from both primary and from secondary sources. And what is also unique for the ATO is that we collect multiple sources for a single indicator. In some cases, our most famous example in that context is road lengths in Asian countries. We are collecting information from at least 6 different sources for that. And then we are looking at multiple dimensions, modes, and scales. In terms of the dimensions, we are looking at the transport sector in its entirety. So we're collecting information on the transport infrastructure, meaning that we have detailed information on road lengths, lengths of railway, ports, etc., in all of the 51 countries that we are looking at. We collect information on transport activity and services. So we are looking at access and connectivity, air pollution, road safety, climate change, and economic impact. I think it's important when we looked at the previous efforts on transport data in Asia, we saw that there was an overemphasis on climate change. And what we are saying is that if we're talking about the transport sector, you need to look at all of these dimensions. We're collecting information at the regional level, at the national level, at the rural level, the urban level, in some cases in the project level. I mentioned already, we have data, we have policy information, institutional information, finance information, and we have done an outlook for 2030 and 2050 as well. We have various products, which I will mention later, and we have all kinds of reports as well. So it's a growing body. In terms of what region are we looking at? Here on the left, you can see we're looking at 51 economies, which includes all the Asian Development Bank members. Plus, we are looking at Russia and Iran. And we're looking at Russia and Iran also in the context of our cooperation with UNCRD and to some extent with UNESCAP as well, who are looking at these countries as well. We also, at the urban level, we're collecting information for 460 cities, of which 412 are in Asia and 48 are global cities, so that you can also do some benchmarking. And we will be looking at 50 cities in much more detail. Then on the right, you can see all these different dimensions, and you can see how many indicators we have in total. At the national level, we are tracking 373 indicators, and at the urban level, we are tracking 281. You can see here, for the majority of indicators, we have multi-year data. And we, at the national level, you can also see that the number of sources that we have for the respective indicators. And the challenge is obviously that not all information is the same for all countries. Like we are depending on what information is being collected and published by the countries itself. So in some cases, for certain indicators, you have good time series for one country, but maybe not for another country. But that's something that you would need to explore in detail. In terms of the knowledge products, you see here an assortment of cover pages. Like if you look in the red box on the top left, there are two here. One is which is about tracking the transport-related targets in the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have done an initial report on this in 2021, and we have updated that here in 2023. We are about to publish the 22-23 climate tracker for transport in Asia and the Pacific, which will be an input to COP28. And then you see various other reports. For the EST people, I would like to flag the baseline report that we did in 2021 for the goals of the IT Declaration on environmentally sustainable transport. And the other one, which I think is of importance, is the Asian Transport Outlook, and in which we said, like, if current policies continue, what would be the transport outlook into 2030 and 2050? But all of these are available on the website. A very recent product is the country profiles, which we now have for I think 39 countries. And you can see here the kinds of things we are collecting there, or documenting their information on the various transport-related targets. And you can find all of that information on the ATO website. So just a very brief introduction to the ATO. I would like to hand over now to Sudhir to go more in depth. And Sudhir will be answering the question, Asian sustainable low carbon transport paradox. Can it be better and worse at the same time? So Sudhir, please explain to us whether it can be better and worse at the same time.
Thank you, Connie. The objective is to showcase the ATO products. So over the next half an hour, the main idea is to showcase some of the findings from the SDG analysis, what we have done, and on the Paris Agreement, the COP tracker, what we have developed. But more importantly, I wanted to go back to these trends, because over the last few months, we have generated nearly 1,500 figures, looking at different trends for different countries, looking at all the 373 indicators, trying to understand what is happening in the transport sector. And there is this question mark: is transport sector becoming better or worse? And within the ATO team, for 1.5 years, we have been arguing with each other whether the trends look better, optimistic to us, or do the trends look bad to us. And somehow I have come to a conclusion that transport sector in Asia is becoming better and worse at the same time. I will try to establish it. Please, without any bias, I will look at these trends. We can showcase only few of the trends, but I can, if you have any questions, we are happy to answer those questions. And there are a lot of figures which you can find in country profiles. I would highly recommend you to look at these country profiles and the SDG PowerPoint presentation what we have. The report is currently under review. So starting with this, I will start with the trends. Now, before understanding the trends, I want to make it very clear that that the growth rates what you are going to see here is not the story in itself. The growth rates do not necessarily tell you the entire story. So what we do in our analysis is we look at not only the growth rate, that is pre-2015, so 2000 to 2015 versus 2015 to 2021, 2022, where the data is available. But more importantly, we look at transport versus other sectors. We look at transport versus in Asia versus other regions. So whenever ATO team says that we collect information for 51 economies, that is partly true, but we also collect information from all the countries what we can find, so that we can benchmark the Asia with regards to the other regions. Okay, now let us start with the economic performance. Now, when you consider these trends, you have to consider COVID, because some of the trends stopped in 2020, some trends 2021, 2022. COVID recovery. If you remember, transport had the biggest impact in terms of the various sectors. The largest drop in transport, the emissions came from the transport. The activity restrictions had a big challenge for the transport sector. So the recovery has been slightly late. But in terms of the economic, the good news, what is the good news on the economic dimension? What we are seeing is that before and after, like if you look at the gross value, the left-hand side curve, the figure, what it shows is that Asia Pacific with regards to the global average in terms of the transport sector. And what it shows is that the gross value added by the transport sector has been growing. And in Asia, it is growing faster than other regions, which is a good news. It has been growing slightly slowly since 2015 because these trends stop in 2021 when the recovery may not necessarily have completed. The news, the main storyline behind this particular curve is that transport sector contributes to about 8% of the GDP. And this share has been consistent over the last 20 years. There is only a fraction increase or fraction decrease, but overall nearly at around 8%, which means that the gross value added by the transport sector has not really outperformed other sectors. What you also need to consider is that while in Asia, the gross value added is growing faster than the other regions. So, for example, from around, we have increased it from nearly, the Asia's share is around, if I remember correctly, it is about 27% to 35%. That is the gross value added Asia's share in transport sector when compared in the global, from 27% to 35%. So this is good news, which means that transport is outperforming other sectors. But if you look at the employment now, the second curve, what you see is that employment is growing slower than the other regions. Of course, it is still growing. It is not that it is reducing, which means that gross value added is increasing. Employment is increasing slower than gross value added, which means that the average productivity is increasing. So the good news is the productivity in the transport sector is increasing. Employment is growing slower than what it has been. There are close to 165 million people employed in the transport sector. This is the assessment what we did in 2021. We have not updated those numbers. But overall, what we feel is that the employment share is also consistent. It is we have got only 2% increase over the last 15 years or so. So currently, it is about 8% of the total employment is within the transport sector. The bad news is the gender in transport now. Of all the female employment in Asia, in different sectors, in Asia, it is only 2.2% of all the female employment. Within transport sector, female, if you compare male and female employment is only about 13%. This is half the share of the OECD countries, the European countries, and all. Now, one of the challenges, one of the lessons what we have learned in ATO is, if you remember, Koni said that we collect data from multiple sources. The problem with the economic dimension is there is hardly any research done by different institutions. So we are basically dependent on one source of information. And what we have realized is when there are multiple sources of information available, our own understanding of that particular numbers becomes better. So here you have to take these estimates with a little bit of pinch of salt because there is only one source. We don't really know what is happening in either at the country level which is publicly reported by the countries or by different other institutions. There is only single source, and this is what it tells us. So it is slightly difficult to understand some of these trends. For example, productivity, why Asia's the productivity is expanding so fast and the productivity in, say, Africa is going down. Why it is going down in Latin American and African countries. So some of these trends need more investigation, and we are hoping that we find more statistics on this. The next slide, please, Connie. Okay, the biggest story in terms of the Asia's over the last 20 years is the infrastructure. Basically, this has been the decade of infrastructure for Asia. Since 2015, 87% of the global road railway increase is in Asia. 81% of the global MRT, basically the rapid transit, basically BRT, metro, LRT lines, it's in Asia. So basically, Asia has phenomenally added the infrastructure over the last 20 years, especially in terms of the kilometers in the last 10 years. You could see some of these curves, like for example, heavy railways, it is little bit stagnant in the first decade and it starts expanding fast. Some of the lessons what we are, when we start looking at these numbers, is the global financial crisis of 2008. We see rapid uptake in the construction rates after that particular financial crisis. So 2008 forms a very big storyline or tipping point for us in terms of the infrastructure in Asia. What we are also seeing is that in spite of all this expansion, what we are seeing is there is an infrastructure gap, and this infrastructure gap is very, very significant. One of the statistics which we often quote is that Asia has 58% of global population, but one-third of the transport infrastructure. When you consider all the different types of inland transport infrastructure added, Asia is about one-third. Sometimes people think that, okay, this is what we are trying to argue is that it need not necessarily be 58% of the total transport infrastructure. It need not be. But what we are saying is there is an infrastructure gap, and Asia would need to bridge this infrastructure gap. Now, how can I convince you with that particular number is the next slide. Connie, next slide, please. Yeah. If you look at the figure on the left-hand side, this is the rural access. On the right-hand side is the urban transit access. So the access to public transit. Basically, what we are using is the SDG indicators, SDG definitions. These are not the numbers which have been generated by the ATO team. This is the universally accepted agreement. The definitions has been agreed upon by the institutions and the countries. So lack of rural access. When we talk about rural access, this is 2 kilometers. People staying less than 2 kilometers from an all-weather road. If you look at this particular estimate, on the x-axis, you have total kilometers per thousand population. That is the access. Probably you could think of this as the kilometers per capita, maybe in terms of the density. Both on the left-hand side, this is the total road kilometers, because we don't necessarily have the split for the rural roads. On the right-hand side, we have the kilometers of rapid transit per million urban population. So the survey, what has been publicly reported in the SDG report is that closely about 408 million, the exact number, is the number of people in Asia who are living more than 2 kilometers from an all-weather road. On the right-hand side is the public transit, where we measure transit access with formal transit stops with 500 meters to 1 kilometer to rapid transit. 1.3 billion people are living either 500 meters or 1 kilometer away from a public transit station. This only considers formal transit systems. It doesn't consider informal transit systems. It doesn't. So you have to again look at these numbers based on the definitions what they have defined. They don't consider the services. This is only the infrastructure part of it. But closely 1.8 billion people, as per the SDG definition, are lacking access in Asia. This is more than 50% of the world's population without access. So more than 50% of the people who are without access anywhere in the world, they are living in Asia. 1.7 billion population. But how is transport performance with regards to the other sectors now? For example, access to electricity. If you look at some of the, this is about 110 million currently people without lacking electricity. This is the rapid transit is basically the bus, the BRT systems, the light rail transit, and the metro systems. These are the three urban transit modes which have been considered as urban rapid transit by ITDP and other organizations. So what we are seeing is in terms of access to clean cooking, 1.1 billion people in Asia are without having access to clean cooking. But if you look at the past 10 years, what has happened is that there is a significant improvement in access to electricity, or bridging the digital divide in accessing the internet, or in terms of access to clean cooking. For example, in India and Indonesia, about 63% of people were having access to electricity in 2010. Now it is 99%. In terms of access to clean cooking in Asia, in India, it was around 62 or 64% in 2010. Now it is about 87%. So there is rapid uptake in other sectors, but this is the challenge where where the transport in Asia, even by 2030, we will not be able to bridge this gap, even with record construction of infrastructure. The next, Kobe, next slide, please. So in spite of rapid increase in the infrastructure, we are seeing high infrastructure gap. The next question is the motorization. The motorization argument, there are two arguments here. The one argument is that motorization has been increasing phenomenally over the last 20 years in Asia, but the increase is not equal or across all the modes. We are seeing a bus crisis, and hardly many people are talking about it. And this is a surprise. And that's why what I did was we have included here three different kinds of numbers what we could think of in terms of bus registrations. We looked at trade of buses. We have looked at even the bus manufacturing. So you could see three different types of numbers to understand what is happening. So if you look at the extreme left, the vehicle registrations, over the last 20 years, Asia has added 1 billion vehicles on the road. 1 billion vehicles. What in majority of the countries, vehicle ownership rates are increasing at around GDP growth rates or slightly below the GDP growth rates. What we are seeing is, in spite of such a phenomenal increase, it is growing twice the rate of the infrastructure. In spite of record infrastructure, building of the infrastructure, vehicle ownership rates are growing twice the infrastructure growth rates. Phenomenal increase. But look at the bus. Over the last few years, we see a stagnation. What we are also seeing is over a period of time, the vehicle growth rates have actually gone down for some of the prominent countries in Asia. So this is a very interesting number which we have to see. But overall, like for example, passenger cars, if you ask me, over the last 10 years, nearly 67, two-thirds of the cars which have been added on the roads from 2015 onwards, actually, they have been added in Asia. So Asia has a big contribution to the entire motorization of the world. In terms of the trade of vehicles, we are looking at used vehicles, we are looking at new vehicles. The number is about 830 billion of trade has happened in terms of last year. This is the economic value of the trade on vehicle import by Asian countries. So 830 billion worth of vehicles have been imported by Asian countries. Over a period of time, what we are seeing is even the vehicle trade collapsed during the COVID, but it has slowly picked up. The two-wheeler, the trade has increased phenomenally. But look at buses. This is something which is very interesting. Neither the bus registrations are increasing, neither the bus import has increased. So the logic is, if the bus imports have not increased, Asia is probably manufacturing a lot of buses. But if you look at the right-hand side, you look at the curve, the bus manufacturing is down 30% compared to 2015. And this is 2022 number. So there is not much of manufacturing also happening. And this is the data which is coming from OICA. So what we are seeing is that there is a bus crisis which is there. Over the last few years, the bus numbers have not increased. The bus share in total numbers of vehicles is reducing. 1 in 4 persons in Asia is owning a vehicle now. So around 278 vehicles per thousand population. 50% of these vehicles are 2 and 3 wheelers, which is a very good news. And it has a big impact on various trends, what you will see in the future because of high penetration of 2 and 3 wheelers. So we collect the vehicle registration data from the national statistics. Now we are collecting, we are developing a mitigation database where we also look at some of the data which is either generated by some of the private sector companies. Next slide, please, Karan. So motorization, but the motorization story is incomplete without telling my own experience. So on the left-hand side, this is the car sales. Now, 15 years back was my first attempt at transport modeling. And this was the study which we did under Jamie. Courtney was also involved. This was 2006, 2007, 2008. And we purchased a lot of data at that point of time. We were trying to develop the first Asian transport outlook in 2008. So this is like 15 years back. And we purchased the data. We purchased projections from one of the leading automotive institutions in the world. If you compare that institution, the right-hand side figure, what we see is that the vehicle projections, what has happened from 2006 to 2008, these estimates were generated in 2006, 2007, 2008. Some of the best researchers and experts have worked in that particular project. What you see is that the current ownership levels are 17% down when you consider the 14 countries. 17% is not that much, considering that this is about 15 years back. But this is apple to orange comparison. The red bar, what you see on the right-hand side, these are vehicles on road, not vehicles registrations. Vehicles on road, is probably 80% or 70% of the vehicle registrations, which means that this difference is more than 40% probably. So what we are seeing is, in spite of record increase in vehicle ownership levels, vehicle ownership has not grown to the extent what we thought it would grow 15 years back or 20 years back. And this is not the only projection what we have seen. There are multiple projections. You can go back in time and look at some of the projections which have been done. If you go back to 2006, 2007, 2008, you look at some of the leading experts, you look at some of the leading arguments. People were saying that everybody in Asia would be owning a car at some point of time. You will have 600 to 700 cars per thousand population. We have, as soon as the GDP per capita will exceed $5,000, these are all peer-reviewed papers, that people will switch from a two-wheeler to a car, and everybody would be at the driving a nano car. At that point, nano was the biggest news with the $1,000 car ownership rates. Everybody would be owning a car. But if you look at the left-hand side, the car sales, what has happened, and I have plotted US 1965 to 2000. At the same GDP per capita, US was entirely a different country altogether. So to assume that Asians would become like and start driving like Americans and some of the developed countries, this is entirely not true. Asians have not abandoned the two and three wheelers, and in spite of that, you have significant increase in car ownership. But what we are seeing is slightly lagging effect, or probably some kind of dip in some of these curves. And this is a very important topic, because since the infrastructure has not grown, at some point we are seeing that the aspiration to own a car has changed to some extent, and Asians have not really started owning the cars as we thought 15 years back people would do. And this has a big impact on all the projections and all the arguments which you will see in the future. So there is a good news, there is a bad news in this particular slide. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the energy, unfortunately, now again, one of the lessons what we have learned in the ATO is that you need to have the latest data. And unfortunately, we are dependent on the energy consumption predominantly from the International Energy Agency. Jacob is here. What we have seen is, since we have only till 2020, some of the trends doesn't necessarily make any sense, because 2020 was the COVID year. Any growth rates what you do may not necessarily be a true growth rate. So on the left hand side, we see energy intensity improvement, which is basically energy consumption by GDP. We see phenomenal reduction. What is the good news is, compared to the other sectors, transport has actually performed well in Asia in terms of energy intensity reductions. Compared to different regions, Asia has a lower energy intensity compared to global average, what you can see on the left hand side. But what it also shows is that there has been significant reductions in energy intensity over a period of time. But this is 2020. We need to look at 2021, 2022 to find better understanding of that particular figure. But the story of energy intensity is predominantly by what is happening to energy efficiency. And one of the strong drivers to this is the fossil fuel subsidies. And Asia was one of the regions which had phenomenal fossil fuel subsidies. If you go back to the 2012 period, where we had significant like 120, more than $130 billion of fossil fuel subsidies in the transport sector. So the Asian trend, what you see in the middle figure, that has gone down. 2021, it has below $38 billion. Now, 2022, definitely there will be a slight increase, because the crude oil prices were very high, and some of the countries had actually reduced a little bit of, had started providing a little bit of subsidies. But I don't think the golden age of the fossil fuel subsidies is going to go back because of the policies what we are seeing. Majority of the countries are making references to elimination of fossil fuel subsidies, and the numbers actually back it. So the good news, if you ask me what is the good news is that Asia's share in the transport sector fossil fuel subsidies has reduced from about from 60% to about 50, somewhere around less than 40%. So from 55% to 40% reduction in Asia's share of global transport sector fossil fuel subsidies. Within Asia, we are seeing that transport sector fossil fuel subsidy share has also shrunk. So which is good news, that transport sector is performing better than the other sectors. The way I look at it is, it is performing better than the other sectors. On the right hand side, the reason I put the slide, the title as slowly and then suddenly. The concept is, with the stock markets, you start losing money slowly and then suddenly. So the right hand side, you see the fuel split. The fuel split, like if you look at the oil share, 97% in 2000, yeah, 92% in 2015, 5% reduction. By 2022, 5% reduction. So what improvement happened in 15 years happened in next 5 years. And the next 5 years would be very interesting trend to see. What we are seeing is rapid uptake of fossil diversification policies, predominantly on the natural gas side. Now, there is a story to be told on Central Asia and some of the other countries in natural gas increase. We are seeing the natural gas consumption in transport increasing from a fraction less than 5% to 40% nearly in some of the Central Asian countries. Because of and when you link it with the policies, you get a very beautiful story. This is something which we want to tell from the ATO side going forward. So you will see more literature on energy consumption coming forward. Next slide, Connie. Yeah, how about hydro and wind power? So for this particular argument, I would actually talk about the grid emission factor, just as a proxy, where the electricity is coming from. And I have a very beautiful slide on China. So grid emission factor, if you look at Asia's grid emission factors, the weighted average, Asia's grid emission factor, the figure is not here. What we see is a slight increase between 2000 to 2010. But since 2010 onwards, we till 2000 to 2015, from 2015 onwards, we start seeing reduction in grid emission factor in Asia. So this is something which we are seeing, and predominantly there are many reasons to this, but we will come to some of these stories a little bit later in terms of but there is phenomenal increase in power generation of renewables, but there is also a bad news there. We will come to that a little bit later. Now, coming to the transport externalities. Transport externalities, we see tipping points. Now, if you have worked on transport air pollution from 1990 onwards, you will realize that transport, let us look at air pollution, transport air pollution. Transport air pollution had the highest intensity of growth, highest magnitude of growth from 1990 to 2000. From 2000 onwards, where we see phenomenal growth in the number of vehicles, but transport air pollution didn't, in terms of emissions, it didn't increase that much. It was not that much. But since in the last decade or so, what has happened is we see phenomenal reductions. And why the reductions have come? The reductions have come basically because of few countries where they have gone for Euro 4 or higher standards. Now, there is a database which is maintained by Clean Air Asia and WINEP, where they monitor 20 countries' emission standards and the fuel quality, the sulfur limits and all. What we see that in 10 out of the 20 countries, 10 countries have Euro 4 or above standards as of 2022 onwards. So there is a phenomenal change in the vehicle technology which has occurred, and because of that, there is reduction. But this reduction is not consistent across countries. If I say that transport has solved the air pollution problem, that would be wrong. But at a regional level, yes, it has been addressed because China is in Euro 6, India is at Euro 6. These two countries are Euro 6, automatically the region will go down. So when you talk about regional averages, that's the story. The bigger countries will dictate the trends. So sometimes you have to look at the trends at the country level. And these countries, this is one of the reasons why we generated 39 country profiles, so that you can go country by country and look at these numbers. The estimates come from IASA, which is Institute of Applied Science based in Vienna, which is a very good institution. They have been doing Edgar modeling. They have estimates till 2018. And we are waiting for the next generation because we know that there will be a reduction, but we want to see how much reduction it would be. But there are even some bad news also there. So every trend, what you see, there is a good news or the bad news. If you ask me what is the bad news on transport air pollution, I see phenomenal increase in inland water share in transport air pollution. That share is increasing phenomenally because of the modal shift policies and because of lack of penetration of clean fuels and vehicles, the engines in the inland waterways and the domestic shipping. If you go to the now road crash fatalities, Asia, 0.8 million people get killed on the roads on the annual basis. So we have the road safety pandemic. Our researchers talk about COVID numbers and road accident fatality numbers, and we did a research and where we estimated that road crash fatalities has killed more people than COVID in Asia. In terms of the economic value, this is about 4 to 6% of the GDP. So there are a lot of stories on road safety. But the next tipping point, what we see is in terms of road crash fatalities. Over the last 20 years, in spite of rapid increase in the number of vehicles, the trend is little bit stagnated to some extent. The growth is not that much, which means that some of the road safety policies have started showing effect. Some of the countries, it has started showing effect. But if you look at the outlook now, it should start. We are very close to a tipping point on road crash fatalities. Now we are eagerly waiting for the WHO statistic, the numbers to come out in November. If you know that WHO numbers doesn't compare with the country numbers, so this is where the ATO beauty comes here, because we collect numbers not only from World Health Organization, we collect numbers from IRAP, we collect numbers from country statistics, so we get a very good idea of what is happening in terms of the numbers. And we think that the tipping point might be very close to crash fatalities, at least at the regional level, not necessarily at the country level, but trends has to be seen. Maybe these are 3 or 4 years ahead, but definitely there is no reduction. So now, if you go to the 2010 global agreement that there will be 50% reduction in road crash fatalities by 2020, it has not happened. By 2030, we don't think we are going to meet the SDG goal in terms of the agreement. So that is the bad news. So if you want to know about the bad news, yes, we are not going to meet any SDG goal where they have defined any kind of target as such. The next slide, please. So now coming to the glass half full argument on the transport carbon emissions. Now, the good news is that transport carbon emissions are 3% below 2018 levels. Now, if you talk about carbon emissions, we have to go back a little bit to on the history side and understand how the trends have been. Transport sector in total fossil fuel carbon emissions, transport sector share was about 10% in 1970s in Asia. In 2022, this is about 11%. From 10%, 11%. In 2000, we were about 13%. So generally, we perceive transport as a hard to decarbonize sector, as a hard to mitigate in Asia, as a hard to mitigate region. Asia is where the phenomenal growth in transport demand is happening. So generally, people are very pessimistic with chances of low carbon transport in Asia because there is a phenomenal increase in numbers. But what we see is that before COVID, if you look at the red line very closely, what you will realize is that there was some kind of stagnation before COVID. It fell down 8% during the COVID, and it has not really recovered that much. Actually, the slope has now slightly built over the last 22. So we are waiting for the 2023 number to understand what has happened. But what is interesting is that at least 50% of the countries in Asia, because of the the COVID recovery has not happened for 50% of the countries. So this is the story what we are seeing in terms of the carbon emissions. It has not grown. It is still below the 2018 and the 2019 numbers. On the right hand side, you see the decoupling argument, and the decoupling is like transport CO2 emissions, GDP growth, whether it is growing faster than the GDP, we say coupling. When it is growing below the GDP, we say relatively or absolute decoupling. If it is going below 0%, when there is a degrowth in transport CO2 emissions. Now, 2000 to 2050, it all depends on which years you take. So the trick the magician trick here is to consider the years, and you can probably show transport in a good light or transport in a bad light by just picking the right years. If I take 2008, I can show something else. But what I'm trying to make is any year what you take, what you will slowly see this trend is, I have plotted this curve in many different periods, trying to understand what is happening. There is a growing share of countries either relatively decoupling or absolute decoupling. This is the story. What it means is transport over time is growing slower compared to the GDP. So this is a story which is very, very interesting. The transport sector emissions are to some extent stagnating. Now, why? This is entirely a different question and different discussion altogether. Why the transport sector? There are many factors to it. At this point of time, COVID takes the cake because COVID was the major disruption which has happened. But the trend has to be understood. You have to look at the country level. Now, next slide, please, Connie. So I will give you a country example. In ATO, we don't like to do cherry picking and pick some country and try to explain it. But here, I think little bit of discussion is warranted. So what I have done is, on the left-hand side, I have plotted China's transport CO2 emissions, the fossil transport CO2 emissions. 4 sectors I have compared: transport, buildings, power industry, and industrial combustion over a period of time. Now, what has happened is, if you've seen all the curves, basically the trends start changing in 2018 because China's trends starts changing in 2018. There was a little bit of stagnation in transport CO2 emissions starting 2018. It fell significantly in 2020, and it has not really recovered. It slightly recovered, and then it has gone down again in 2022. If you compare 2018 and 2022 number, the transport CO2 emissions is 8% below the 2018 number, 8% below in China. If you compare the power generation, Now, Asia, like power generation, the story is China. China. Everybody knows that the renewable share is increased, phenomenal increase in renewable solar energy. Yeah, you talk about anything on renewables, China comes as the leading light. But if you look at the power generation emissions, there is a phenomenal increase, 16% increase compared to 2018 numbers. You ask me why? Because there has been a collapse of hydro energy in China because of the heat waves and all. And what has happened is the solar and the other renewable energy has basically close down the gap of the hydro energy. So in terms of the emission factors, it has not changed significantly. What we see is the power generation emissions and the consumption has phenomenally increased. So what we see is 16% increase. In terms of industrial emissions, industrial combustion, this is about 9% increase compared to 2018 levels. So power generation emissions have gone up, industrial emissions have gone up, but there is a stagnant 8% reduction in transport CO2 emissions. Now, to validate this, you need to somehow look at the transport activity. And the most accurate number, like from the statistical yearbook, is the commercial vehicle transport travel, what you can find. Private, the numbers are always, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. So if you look at the freight growth demand in Asia, in China, the demand has grown compared to 2018 by 10% by 2022. So COVID recovery. And one of the things you also need to notice is that freight demand didn't decrease that much significantly during the COVID year. Passenger transport fell down significantly. Freight demand didn't fall down. So what you see is that there is the demand is increasing, at least on the freight side. And we know that China is the factory of the world. There is a phenomenal freight transport demand which is being generated. And we know that there is this particular story. So sometimes country estimates the numbers. When you try to correlate with each other, you try to see some trends and you can dig further. But what we are saying is transport CO2 emissions is growing a little bit slower over time due to many reasons. And this has a big effect in various other things. And I will try to correlate with policies now. Next slide, please, Connie. Okay, now let us talk about policies. Now, ATO is, we are doing something very ambitious on terms of the policies. What we are doing, we have more than 1,100 policy documents. We tell this very, we are very proud of this particular fact that we have 1,100 policy documents. We collect the latest transport policy document. So whatever the latest road master plan, rail master plan, energy efficiency plan, yeah, any plan what you can find, any strategy what we can find, any policy document, regulation what we can find with an official logo, we collect it in our database. So we have nearly 1,100 policy documents from 51 economies. At this point of time, we have analyzed nearly 15 countries. 15 countries, this is about 294 policy documents. So the next few slides, what you are seeing is the sample of what we have collected from the 294 policy documents. Now, to understand the policy documents, we have what we call as ATO policy trackers. Now, what are these trackers? We have divided the policies into 294 measures cutting across different dimensions, 294 measures. We measured 294, we have a filter of 294 measures cutting across road safety, cutting across economic dimension, cutting across gender, cutting across energy efficiency, cutting across all the different aspects what we can find. 294 measures, we try to understand what the policy documents, what are the priorities they mention, what kind of recommendations they do. So this is the most exhaustive analysis what I've been involved in. And this is, we are still scratching the surface, I would say. But it has started telling us some very interesting stories because we have seen the trends. The crown jewel of the ATO, I keep telling our staff, is that is the policy documentation what we have, the policy analysis what we are doing. Now, if you see cumulative policy documents over a period of time, there is a story to be told. What is this is predominantly in the 2000 to 2010, predominantly the transport policies were infrastructure oriented. They talked about transport master plans, infrastructure plans. The externalities started growing fast after 2008, 2009. It has gone phenomenally high. Now, there is a question that are we having any bias? But I believe that the bias is nullified to an extent because we are collecting the latest policy document. So we are like, it is easy to find documents in public for the recent years compared to the historical levels. So that is the bias I'm talking about. My argument is that we are looking for the latest version of the policy document. If there is a road master plan which has been published, and if we can find it online, if it has been updated, we will collect it. what we are seeing is something very, very interesting, and that the policy documents of Asian countries are also evolving, and they are evolving in. And I would actually congratulate the policymakers, because we generally perceive that policymakers are not really looking into number of solutions here. Like for example, 2000 to 2015, average number of measures what we found was 11. In 2016 to 2023, we see 80. There is a big jump in number of measures being recommended. We see greater diversity in the solutions. So we see that there is a predominant focus on externalities now, but infrastructure is still a priority. So there is still that there is this. So this is where the sustainable low carbon transport argument comes in. That there is the focus on infrastructure, there is the focus on activity, but access connectivity, but also on the externality side. Next slide, Pranay. I'm losing out on my time, but I will try to cover fast. So the next question which I have to answer is the skewed perspective. And this is something which I'm guilty of myself and Korni. I think both of us are responsible, because we did the first assessment of the indices in 2015. We analyzed nearly 140 countries. So generally, what is happening in our community is that we are looking at transport sector, we are looking at NDCs, and we are forming a judgment on the transport policies, the mitigation policies, and the adaptation policies of the countries by looking at the NDCs. And what we believe is that this is entirely a story which is of elephant and the blind people. What is happening is we are looking at only a small share of the transport policy measures and forming a judgment on the transport sector. If you look at all the transport policy documents, you see the phenomenal increase in transport climate mitigation and adaptation measures. And what the NDCs say, NDCs say only 10%. There are 90% measures which you will find outside NDCs. So to form a judgment on the transport sector climate ambition by just looking at NDCs is not fair. This is the learning for us, because we started looking at these NDCs very closely. So what we are saying is go beyond NDCs, go beyond NDCs. And the third figure is the text box. And what we are seeing is there is this integration of sustainable low carbon transport. Rather than focusing just on the low carbon, we see greater diversity of solutions in the transport policy documents. This is actually a good news, but what we find. Now, what is the mistake in our analysis? I would say the limitation, not the mistake. The limitation in our analysis is we don't necessarily look at the implementation. We only look at recommendations, policy priorities, recommendations. We are not really judging whether they have been implemented or not. Next slide, please, Kone. So what we are seeing is, in terms of the policy typology, then again, there is a bias. If you talk to the various stakeholders, many stakeholders think that transport solutions are predominantly one-dimensional, or basically they are silver bullet solutions are being applied by the policymakers. This is not true. If you look at this particular curve, over a period of time, you see lot of policies talking about financing. You see a lot of policies talking about raising capacity. You see a lot of policies talking about having better plans, establishing targets. You see infrastructure. You look at services. You look at operational. You look at data and information. So what I'm trying to indicate is that over a period of time, we are making better plans. Yeah, these are all subjective, but in terms of this, we are not basically developing an infrastructure plan, and we are not really doing anything. That would be unfair to the policymakers in Asia. We see greater diversity of solutions, but we don't judge the implementation part of it. Next slide, please. So let me summarize. Next slide. We have a lot of targets now. So we have targets. We look at policy measures. If you ask me which country in Asia has an electricity in railways target, I can tell you what target is that. If you ask me which country in Asia, like any researcher, you ask us like which country in Asia has carbon pricing recommendation. Yes, there is a long presentation. Sorry, there are lot of targets, lot of value in the policy analysis. Next slide, please. I'll try to close it now. One more slide. So next slide, Connie. Next slide. So we have all these things. We are seeing one more news. The message what we have is we see hardly any resilience in transport policy measures. So we can also find the gaps. Resilience is a gap. What we see, 30% of transport infrastructure in Asia is Asia has 30% of the transport infrastructure global, but 60% of the damages. In terms of the trade, it is very, very high. And in terms of policies, there are only few policies on resilience, not many on resilience. So this is the story. Next slide, please, Connie. So let me just close it. We are seeing a shift in the investment. we are seeing now, this is a very interesting, important slide to, yes, the investment profiles of transport sector is also changing. Now, when you look at this particular chart, 65% of money in 2000 to 2010 went to roads, 23% to heavy rail, 5% to HSR, 6% to metro, and there are a few more on the BRT and LRT lines. We see significant change in the investment. And these are the numbers which have been quantified based on the average unit infrastructure cost, based on the infrastructure construction, what has done. We look at CapEx and OpEx in terms of the infrastructure construction as such. But 2011 to 2020, we see reduction in roads, and we see an increase on the public transit side of it, on the railways and the HSR. So this is the good news. Ask me the bad news. I will tell you that between 2020 to 2030, the number of railways which is going to be constructed is probably lower than what we constructed the last 10 years, because we are also looking at what kind of plans are coming up. So in our outlook, we made this argument that only 18,000 kilometers of railways are currently in the tendering stage. I'm talking about heavy railways, either in execution or in the design stage. So there is, if we are not going to build faster, the investment profile will keep changing. Next slide, please. Yeah, and over a period of time, in this particular slide, what we see is that the emission modelers are becoming more optimistic with transport CO2 emissions projections. Optimistic means that transport growth rates, emission growth rates are going down over a period of time under the reference scenario or the BAU scenario. Reference or BAU scenario generally considers transport emission, the BAU projections with the current policies as such. Sometimes people think that this is a bandwagon effect where one institution has put a number and other institutions are trying to follow it. No, that is not necessarily the case, because we have seen that in transport policies, we see a phenomenal increase in transport mitigation policies. We know that transport policy making is in a much better shape compared to last 20 years, last 15 years, last 5 years. So there is a movement which is happening. So the growth rates are going down. It looks okay. The last slide, please. So the question which I had is transport becoming better or worse at the same time? If you look at the left-hand side, the red line is all the measures what we had before 2015, the projections before 2015. If I consider transport CO2 emissions was growing from about 2.8 gigatons in 2018 to about 7 gigatons by 2050. If I take from 2015 onwards, and if I take the recent numbers, what we are seeing is somewhere around 4 gigatons. If we take only the last 2 years, the mitigation, the reference scenarios over the last 2 years, we are going towards the 3 gigatons. So we are actually going down below the yellow line if we take only the estimates which have come over the last 2 years. So what we are seeing is the transport emission projections are becoming optimistic with chances of the transport. Transport is not the most difficult sector to decarbonize, and Asia is not the most difficult region to decarbonize, in spite of record increase in the transport infrastructure, in the activity, etc. and etc. The tipping point will come. But the challenge is not only to go towards the 500 million ton, but to solve the infrastructure gap, to solve the activity, the connectivity gap what we have, the Asia has to consider, to reduce the road accident fatalities, to reduce transport air pollution, to reduce the logistics cost, to improve the resilience, to make an inclusive transport. These are the challenges which needs to be incorporated here. And with the policies, we see slight shift. Is the transport becoming better or worse, or becoming better or becoming worse, or becoming better and worse at the same time, is the question which you need to answer. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you very much, Sudhir. I think that there is one thing clear, that it's difficult to provide a clear, concise answer to whether it's better and worse at the same time. But it also shows that that there is the challenge that we are starting to have in the ATO is that the multitude of stories that can be told. So I think that's a clear issue. Before we go to the individual questions, I would like to hand over to Andres Pizarro of AIIB to also give maybe a perspective from the side of AIIB, how they are looking at the ATO, and in what respects the ATO is useful for AIIB. Andres?
Thank you, Connie, and thank you, Sudhir, for this very interesting presentation. I have to join what Jamie said at the beginning in terms of what this instrument means to multilateral development banks. And I'd like to also highlight that this is a tool that doesn't exist in other regions. I mean, this is an effort that is very useful, very comprehensive, and of high quality, that when we've been looking with our MDB colleagues in other regional banks, they don't have this. So this is a first point that I'd like to highlight and congratulate the team and Jamie and ADB for financing this originally. As soon as Corny mentioned this to me, AIB jumped on the opportunity to also contribute, because in my 30 years of international experience in transport, one of the things I have come to believe is at the end of the day, policies may change, projects may change, but what remains is the data. And the data can be used by us, practitioners, but by a number of people and institutions that we might not even think will use the data. And I mean, to mention one obvious is academia. And so this is a tool that is going to have an incredible impact, not just, you know, for us around the table here, but for, as I say, people in institutions we would not even think about. For us, it's beginning, originally this is something the transport team and my team in particular jumped on the opportunity to work with. It is now permeated, I'd say, to most of the institution, and our climate change colleagues are more and more interested and are asking for contributions that have to do more with climate than transport. So we have to kind of let's say mitigate their enthusiasm so that this doesn't go all over the place. The last point that I'd like to make is to thank ADB and ATO to allow us to participate, and to those of you around the table that do not come from NDBs, this is another point to highlight. There aren't that many joint MDB collaborations of this type around the world, and we hope to continue. And if other MDBs want to join us, it'd be great. But at the moment, we're working very well and in good harmony with ADB on this and with Corny, Sudhir, and team. So again, congratulations to all, and thank you again for this presentation.
Thank you, Andres. And then I think that maybe you said that instead of that you need to mitigate the enthusiasm of the climate team, maybe we need to adapt to the enthusiasm of the climate team, because I think that in a way, and Sudhir pointed it out as well, like the discrepancy between NDCs and LTSs. The reality is that a lot of the development debate is being dominated by the climate teams. And so in a way, like if there is an interest from the climate team in the ATO, and I think that this whole challenge, like what Sudhir was saying about comparing the transport sector to other sectors, I think that this definitely is a good venue to actually get transport on the radar of the climate teams, because I think that's something which has been missing in the past as well. I think that there was one person who had raised his hand, so we will go first to Suresh, and then I saw that Sophie Punta had a question as well. But first, Suresh, over to you. And please unmute yourself. If Suresh is, we will come back then to Suresh later. Sophie, would you like to ask the question in person?
Yeah, yes, happy to. Oh, it's just so nice to listen to this and see former colleagues on screen. And to listen to Sudhir without being able to interrupt him is a little bit frustrating, but hey, there we go. Yeah, I was wondering because it's fantastic what you've established. I mean, really fundamental and something that lasts, right? So it's not like a one-off project that stops, but something that invests in the future. But I was wondering if it could be used the other way around, so that, for example, imagine a country like Malaysia, right, saying, okay, we now need to update our NDCs and all policies associated with that. Could you use this database to sort of reverse engineer it and say, okay, you need to do this on gender, this on adaptation, not just mitigation. If you remove fossil fuel subsidies, that's a better policy than, for example, restricting access of vehicles, la la la. So as to prepare a package of policies that is substantiated by data on what will be impactful, and ideally what has proven in other countries to work, because many policymakers are quite insecure and they're worried to enact the wrong policies if those are not impactful. So is that possible?
Yeah, Sophie. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your question. Yes, it can be done actually, because the standard template is adopted for the policy analysis. What we are doing, so you will know the gaps, you will know the opportunities. The main reason we did the policy analysis was to start with that the data what you see may not necessarily tell the whole story what is happening. So we wanted to look at the policies. So we started collecting various policy documents. Now we have a better understanding of what the sector is doing. So if you look at the country profiles, you will see that which dimensions need more attention, which dimensions they are doing better. If they are doing better, why? If there is a gap, you can also trace it down to the data. So there are multiple products which we have been so ATO we have used a staircase approach where we have started adding products as over a period of time. This year we are adding a mitigation database, because you also need to know not only what the policies are being, for example, recommended, but what kind of policies are being modeled. If you know what kind of policies are being modeled, you can easily trace it down and you can understand how much of mitigation potential will come from these policies. So it is, you can use the policy data to actually come up with better policy documents, because you can benchmark countries, you can understand where the policies are working, why the policies are working. You can do. I think there is a lot of wealth to the researchers, to the experts to understand the data and to combine it with the policies. I think you can tell better stories with this. There are so many stories to be told, Sophie. I went overboard. I actually had to. It was only 30 minutes presentation. I had to go overboard, but I have not really told what the trends, what we see, the total trends, what we see in the transport sector.
Okay, we'll continue the conversation in Manila.
Yeah. But Sophie, I think one of the things that Sudhir mentioned in the presentation is that we are, let's say, as part of this incremental approach, in the first round, we identified the policy documents. We're currently unpacking these into, let's say, what specific policy measures are being included in these policy documents. But what Sudhir also indicated, that one of the challenges, and you're pointing at that, is how effective individual policies have been in individual countries. That remains, let's say, a task that we would need to look at in the future, because, as you know, success has many fathers. Failure is an orphan. But yeah, it's something to look at the future. I think I saw that Jacob has also raised his hand. Jacob.
Thanks, Tony. Excellent presentation, Sudhir. I really like that you went into the details. You mentioned in passing policy-driven uptake of natural gas and transport.
Sorry, you're suddenly muted, Jacob. We still heard that you say you mentioned in passing, and then after that you dropped off.
Any better now?
Yeah.
Okay, turned off the Bluetooth. You mentioned in passing policy-driven uptake of natural gas in transport, and I wonder if you could say a few more words about that, the rationale, whether it's kind of concerns over local air quality, energy diversification. And I guess my concern is that it doesn't really help on either of those metrics in practice. And a second question, just you mentioned that the major kind of limitation of the work you've done so far is tracking implementation. And it does sound like in the incoming iterations, you're going to try to start to look at implementation. And so maybe if you could say a bit more about that, that'd be great too. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. The argument what I wanted to make with the natural gas is not to say whether this is good or bad. What to indicate was that the trends what you see are basically dictated by some of the policies objectives what the countries have. Certain countries have predominantly emphasized, prioritized. For example, Uzbekistan, I think the natural gas was around 3 or 4% in 2000. And now it is around 37, 38% in 2020. There is a rapid uptake based on the policies. Now, you look at the data, you know that there is something which has happened in terms of transport energy consumption. There is a big change. What has happened, for example, in biofuels, or it could be natural gas in certain countries. Then since we have the policy trackers now, we have a better handle on understanding what the performance has been and why certain changes have occurred. And why it has occurred? Because, for example, it could be about pricing. So there is an economic instrument which has been applied by that particular country. So we know, since we map the policy recommendations to nearly 265 disaggregated measures, we are, to some extent, I think we can start tracing some of the trends what we have seen. So that was the idea which I wanted to say. Whether the natural gas is good or bad, I'm not really, we are not really saying anything about that. But what we are saying is, if you marry or if you combine the transport data and policies, you get a better perspective. And we have started seeing that with the 15-country analysis what we have done. One of the very good stories is why the policies, some of the policy recommendations are very good. We see same recommendations in different types of policy documents. Be it the national, whether for example, certain documents which are published by, it could be by the Prime Minister's office, or it could be published by the Energy Division, or it could be published by the Climate Division. We see same kind of targets. We see same kind of mention of certain measures. When we see that, we know that there has been better coordination. So we see a lot of stories now in the policy side. And this is something which is very interesting for us, and we want to go on that particular direction. Now this is a very interesting question, whether the policy recommendations at some point, are we going to talk about it? This is something, the conversation we are having within the team. This is too exhaustive a task, 1,100 policy documents. In spite of spending 4 months, we have not reached to 297 policy documents. So this will come at some point of time, because we use the staircase approach. At this point of time, we are building the building blocks, and then we will start analyzing it. So there might be, we might go in that direction, but at this point of time, there is no agreement as such within the ATO team. Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe to add to that, Sudhir did not go into a great deal of detail on the Outlook report that we did, I think, last year. The Outlook report, which is available on the website of the ATO, is, you could say, is a reference scenario. It indicates what might, or let's say what could happen based on historical performance and based on policies that were in place at that time. So Sudhir indicated that we see that there is you could say, an intensification of policy making in Asia, which is happening. So, like, one of the things that people have not yet raised in the questions is, like, if we see a greater number of policies and greater number of policy measures, what about the ambition level? Because that is obviously, so while it might be difficult to say something in detail about how effective policies have been made, in the next round of analysis, it will be possible to say something about, do we see a scaling up of ambition level? In connection with that, we are also having a discussion internally for phase 4, is that we say, like, when we are coming to an update of the Outlook report, like, can we also do a scenario based on stated policies? And as we see that the policies are developing rapidly, so that could also give a different perspective in how the landscape is going to unfold. But I think Sudhir mentioned the staircase approach. He mentioned building blocks. you could also say, like, if we look at these policy measures, we talk literally about thousands of puzzle pieces. And so how do you put that all together? And that is something that we are trying to figure out in the next couple of months as well. But it's clear that in order to make the ATO relevant to the policymakers, that these questions about ambition level, questions about effectiveness of policy, questions about what would be the impact of these increased, more ambitious policy, that these will be important. And if we are able to find methodological approaches for that, that I think would enhance further the relevance of the ATO to the region. Other questions? Because I don't see too many questions. I think that the team has answered already some of the questions in chat which were asked during the presentation. Anybody else? One of the questions which was asked is like, will the slides be available? Yes, the slides will be available. Will be made available through a link to the participants, and there will be a recording which will be available as well of the webinar. Good. If there are no questions, then I propose that we come to an end. We are looking forward to interacting with all of you. I think that please engage with us either on X or on our LinkedIn account or by email. And then obviously we will be meeting a lot of the people in Malaysia as well for the EST forum. And we are happy to sit together with the country delegates then to look specifically at what we have in the ATO for your respective countries. Because as Sudhir said, regional pictures do tell one story, but if you live in Cambodia or if you live in Nepal, it is sometimes difficult to really understand how you fit into the bigger picture. But we have information on that. Yeah. With that, a big thanks to the entire ATO team for preparing the webinar. And until the next time, bye-bye.